So today, welcome everyone. This is again one of our webinars that we run on customer analytics and customer lifetime value. We are very excited to host a really good friend, Neil Hoyne, who I've had the pleasure to know for almost the last 2 years, and we've chatted a bunch about this topic over and over again. So my name is Emad Hasan. For those who haven't heard me before, I'm the co-founder of a company called Retina, and I've been very interested in this topic all the way from my Facebook and PayPal days prior. Neil's joining me today. He's an acclaimed leader in the field of customer analytics. He's a lecturer, a keynote speaker, inventor of dozens of patents, and appointed a senior fellow at the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania. He's Google's chief measurement strategist, and he's challenged the limits of traditional measurement when it comes to digital advertising. And he's pioneered new strategies. He's partnered up with Peter Fader on looking at customer lifetime value from a customer level point of view. So I think he's going to have tons of really good insights for us. I'm excited to have him join us. We have a ton of questions that we chatted about that we'll go through, but I want this to be very, very interactive as we do with most of our webinars. So what we'll do is we'll try to follow a very similar pattern, which we did in the past, where we'll cover a couple of topics between Neil and myself for maybe 5 minutes at most. We'll try to keep it as short as possible so that we have you participate and share your questions. As we start to have the conversation, please start to fill up your questions in our Q&A section, and we'll start to answer them as they come up. Before I get going, I'll also want to start with a quick poll. And if you guys get a chance, please answer that. That will give us a sense of where the audience generally is with this topic. And we can tailor the conversation based on that as well. And I'll keep the poll open for about 5 minutes, and then we'll close it to see where most folks are. Two things, Neil, that are on everyone's mind is attribution of customer acquisition and lifetime value. Would love to kind of hear your thoughts about where the world is today from your point of view. But before we go into that, I want to hear what gets you excited about this. When we first started chatting, I told you about what got me excited about this is seeing that there is a large, if you look at just the US market, $336 billion are spent on digital advertising. And we were just talking before the webinar, at most about 3% is relevant if you look at click-through rates and engagement. And that's abysmal for efficiency rates for any system in the world, any engineering built system. So that's what gets me excited that, hey, what can we do to make that system even more efficient by 10, 15, 20%, because that would have a huge impact on our market, on this industry, and a lot of our experiences with advertising would get a lot better. So that's what got me excited. But Neil, I want to kind of hear from you, how did you get into this and what got you started?
You know, I think it's strange for anyone to get excited about an analytical subject. It's like, why do you want to read? So it ties to the opportunity, but I'll give you two areas in particular. One is that just fundamentally as people, we survive and we thrive on the idea of relationships. And just think about it in an offline context. When you go to stores, restaurants, hotels, you interact with people and you appreciate, you treasure those human moments. You connect with people. They know who you are, you know who they are, and they can personalize and deliver service. And I just found that almost completely lacking in an online context. Everyone talks about personalization and the right message at the right time, but then kind of balanced by the fact that we were only looking at individual transactions. When that transaction is completed or that cookie is deleted, that relationship restarts. More tactically, it came up because when I joined Google almost a decade ago, I started working on attribution models. And one of the things that I fundamentally couldn't get past was how these attribution models, and if you're new to the area, just looking up multiple interactions, how they lead to a purchase, but then they reset. So we were looking at everything and saying, oh, this is what led us to that first purchase. And then we said, good, what about that second purchase? It was like, well, we're only going to look at what happened in that 45-day window prior to that purchase and start over. And it just seemed to be like an obvious mismatch, an obvious opportunity. And the more that I've gone into the field, the more that I've looked at the models, at the use cases, at the companies who are doing this and are doing it well, you see that that's where they tie the two together. They are able to predict how their customers will behave. They're able to make decisions on it. And the world and their investments just seem to make a lot more sense and more sustainable than companies that are just going and saying, I want to chase one more transaction, one more conversion today than I had the day before.
Yeah, no, I that makes a lot of sense. Now, the very next question that most people ask, so I think this is the world that we live in with subscription and repeat purchase behavior. Maybe if people weren't on board with that 3 or 4 years ago, now everybody feels that pain. But the very next thing that most people that we've seen do is build a cohort chart where they're looking at retention, multiplying it by average order value to get to their customer lifetime value. That's how we've in the traditional analytics world thought about that. What do you think about that, and where do things go from there?
I wish you didn't mention my MBA before I joined this. Look, I came in, I learned a lot about customer lifetime value when I was an MBA student. But what I couldn't bridge at that time was that a lot of it was based on assumptions. You said, what is your retention rate? What's our discount rate going to be? What's average order value going to look like for all customers? And that didn't make a lot of sense to me. Because what's wonderful is that customers behave differently, that some customers will spend a lot, some will spend very little. And so when we talk about calculating lifetime value, what we have to do is we have to separate ourselves from some of the mistakes that were made in the past. And I will freely admit that if you go to Google right now and you type how to calculate lifetime value, I think every answer on the first 2 pages of search results are entirely wrong. There is a science, there is a method to modeling it. Now, what I'll say is this: if you want to learn how to calculate it, the first thing is you have to look at the research that's already been done. So something, Emad, that you mentioned, Pete Fader from Wharton has done an outstanding job really leading this field and coming out with a series of models that are open source, which means any company, any customer could use this with a limited amount of data, and they perform really, really well. So I say when we're calculating, the first thing that we do is we separate ourselves and we say, look, the old methods, the simple ways that you see these online calculators where you enter in 3 or 4 numbers, we want to ignore those. The second is we want to educate ourselves to say, what are the foundational models? What are people really using, knowing that they're achievable, that you don't have to share data with anyone, and that the data it does require. We're talking 3 things: a transaction date, a transaction amount, and some non-PII identifier to tie together multiple transactions by the same person. Those are now accessible. Those are within your grasp, where reasonably you could do them today. And then we say, all right, now you got the foundation. And then we say, all right, we see companies saying we want to take it even another step, which is to say, hey, these models may take a couple transactions by a customer to get a good sense as to who they are. Can we get something a little bit earlier? Or we're going to go through and say, we have other information about customers, where they came from, the products they purchased. Can we integrate those into the model? And that's where you build your proficiency. So the first is we get rid of what we know in the past. The second is look at all the foundation models that are out there, these core packages that were popularized by these professors and work really well. And then think about internally how you can build out your practice to supplement it and to overcome just some of the limitations of these models and customize them for your business's needs.
Yeah, I love that. And one thing that I'm a huge fan of Peter Fader and Dan McCarthy, who worked along with Bruce Hardy over in the UK. They've worked on this for a long time. And one of the things that when we looked at all of the research, Wharton has this database which has transactions for hundreds of companies and they've been able to test these models on all of those companies before they said, hey, look, we think that these models are universally applicable. So I was excited to kind of read about that, and it's happened over the last 30 years. What is it about these models that you think makes them valuable from, like, is it the fact that they're at the customer level? Is it the fact that they can do financial level forecasting? Like what gets them, like if somebody in the audience is thinking about, hey, I want to improve my customer acquisition and marketing campaigns, what is it about these models they should be looking out for?
I think you touched on one of them already. Differences between individual customers are important. This is one of the ways that if I'm meeting with a company and they're saying, oh, we do lifetime value, and I ask them about it and say, oh, our average customer spends X, you have a sense about the sophistication of it, which means you really need that individual level behavior. But what I think really is, I think there's something a little bit earlier about this, is that these models, take something and they say it is now accessible to companies. And so what it does is it's kind of like, they work, so you don't have to build up a data science practice internally just to figure out the lifetime value. You want to get that done and out of the way as quickly as possible. But here's the evidence. Here's what gives us a little bit of confidence. There was a gentleman, an analytical lead out of our Prague office, that as part of his PhD dissertation looked at 83 different ways that retailers could calculate lifetime value. So combining everything on the machine learning side to all of these models to what Pete's built. And he still found that these types of techniques that Pete Fader and Bruce have recommended still are outperforming all other options, which is fantastic. And I should have brought a link to that paper because it's just a wonderful piece of research. And the reason you look at it is because it gives you confidence that the predictions you see are going to be durable going forward. Those are the questions. The two questions that companies generally have. One is, can I do this? And we're saying, yes, you can. The second one is, do I trust this? Do I trust this to go from a model to say, here, somebody converts its money in my pocket, to a model saying this customer may not spend a lot now, but over the next 6 months, over the next year, over their lifetime, they will. That requires a lot of trust. And so it's great to see things that are transparent, published and peer-reviewed, versus just a black box to say, trust us, these customers will be great. Now there's more scrutiny to say there's a whole bunch of research, decades worth, that says these models, in fact, perform really, really well. And that's why we should use them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. This is a good stopping point. I'll end our poll. It looks like the poll results are super interesting. Let's see if there's an easy way for me to share the results with the whole group. I'll share the results. Not surprisingly, can you guys see the results, by the way?
Yeah.
Neil. All right, cool. This is really cool. Like, most people are very interested in improving acquisition cost and marketing campaigns. This is a good stopping point. If anybody has any questions, please start to share now, and then we'll move on to the next topic. One of the things that I was thinking about as we worked with companies and trying to understand what their pain points are. One thing that we get to see for e-commerce companies, and even to a good extent subscription companies, is the problem of one and dones. When we think about improving acquisitions, we can probably get a ton of companies and ton of customers to convert for that first transaction, but going from that first to the second and third, and really knowing which of the 3,000 customers I converted yesterday will come back for long-term repeat purchase behavior. What are some strategies that you're seeing that help us think about that, Neil? And then we'll wait for some other questions to come in as well.
So since 54% of people says they want to learn about acquisition, let's talk a little bit about the process. What are companies really doing? So the first thing is, you say you want to be able to calculate lifetime value in a way that not only you feel comfortable with, but is at an individual level, and that also respects the differences for your type of business and some of the complexities in it. And then people say, all right, so I get this, and picture it almost as a spreadsheet, right? In one column, you have all these customer identifiers, whether it's an email address or a loyalty program number. And in the second column, you have their lifetime value. And people say, well, that's great. So I know how much my existing customers are going to spend. What do I do with it? And I think that's really the crux of it. When we talk about acquisition, the next question is to figure out why. What makes these customers different? So if you go back to that spreadsheet example, say, all right, column 3, what channel were they acquired on? Column 4, what time of the year? Column 5, what products did they? Oh, there we go. We have a chart on like this. I think these are illustrative, but generally the idea is this is how you want to form your understanding of your customers. Almost as not personas, but this idea of a behavioral picture. What are they actually doing? And how does that relate to the lifetime value of your customers? And this forms the foundation of it, because as you'll see this, inevitably we see companies go through and they say some campaigns, some channels are driving better customers to us than others. Some behaviors we need to look out. Some products might just be gateway products into our larger portfolio. They start and they spend small, and then they spend a little bit more. But this is the understanding you want to get. So you get past that LTV, and now you're saying why. And I think there's another table on the next slide. Jump to that one, because I think this one, oh yeah, this is a fun one. What this starts to do is challenge a little bit of the way that you're currently seeing your business. Now, this is a rough chart, but I'll walk you through it. In that left side, you may say, well, what did these customers buy for their very first product? Now, it's very likely that in that first column where you see predicted AOV, that could also be seen as maybe this is how much they spent on their first purchase. Now, if you saw that, you would say, oh, well, people that are buying pants are clearly better. So we're going to spend more advertising money. They're going to look like they're performing better on a CPA basis. That's where we want to acquire more customers because they're spending a lot more. And then we say, well, wait a minute, maybe we want to go to revenue. How much revenue are they going to bring in over their lifetime? And now we see a slightly different story. Now we see, wait a minute, shoes are bringing in $1,700 per customer over their lifetime versus those pants are only bringing in $850. And now what we're seeing is we would make different decisions. Or if you go to margins, you're going to get a different decision. These, of course, depending on how the business operates. But what you see is a transition to say you would make different decisions now that you have different data. And that's a cool second part of it, is because the first part, we just want to understand what the number is. But now we get to understand why. And people use this oftentimes. They haven't done it yet with curbside pickup, Emad. I'm wondering when those come out. Yeah. But what they're doing it with is just things to say, look, I have a mobile app. Do people that download my mobile app spend more money? Do they spend more time with me? And I'm going to sidestepping the causality discussion here. But that's a real debate. So say you had two customers and some had the app, some didn't have the app. And what if I told you that they were still spending the same amount of money? They still had the same lifetime value. Well, now you may have some questions. Say, I thought the app would be driving more value for our customers. And you start to think about different ways instead of just looking at that conversion number. So that's a very long-winded thing, but that's kind of the idea, is you want to just understand why. You want to understand what makes customers great and what makes customers not so exciting.
I want to share an example of what you just mentioned. So one of the companies we've worked with, they have a nice custom onboarding quiz that they make their customers take. And one of the questions is, what's your hair color? And this product is for women's hair color business.
Okay.
And what's really amazing is that their product works really well for a certain type of hair color and doesn't work that well for another type of hair color. And this shows up in the data, where every time they acquire a customer that is of a certain hair color, product works really well. LTVs or an order of magnitude different versus the ones with the other less likely to be high LTV hair color, one and done customer again and again and again. And that's a really good example. And what was really interesting to me is that while this was started off as a marketing discussion, very quickly it turned into a product market fit discussion as well. Because so marketing is doing a really amazing job of bringing the customer in the door, but turns out the product's not doing a great product fit for this one type of a customer.
The model is flipping itself, right? I mean, when we talk to a lot of marketers, you get this, right? Is they'll say, product builds something, and then our goal is to sell as many of those through the market as we can.
Yeah.
And now you have marketing almost flipping around and saying, hey, we're looking at our customers. This is what's happening with them. These are the people that are spending. This is how we're driving growth. And that goes back to product and says, this is what we need to build. But that's like kind of the end goal of this. The end goal of this is to say, if you have some customers in your business that are spending the most money, and with mobile gaming, we always see that mobile gaming, it's generally we see, 0.2% of customers driving 98% of revenue. Otherwise, most businesses, the 80-20 rule applies, right? 80% of your value from 20% of your customers. You owe it to yourself to know what those 20% of the customers want. And maybe you don't want to build and shift your entire product strategy for it. But if you're doing a test, if you're doing a survey, if you're collecting data, wouldn't you want to pay just a little bit more attention to what those customers think? And that's a practice right now that we see ramping up, is more and more people are saying, look, if I'm going to do an A/B test to say what creative or what copy works best, they now want to know, well, I just don't want to know what works best across all my customers. I want to know what works best with the customers who are going to give me the most amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Neil, can you share an example of like, Google clients that you might have worked with, and you can keep it obviously completely anonymized, but what are the top things that come up when it comes to the conversation of measurement and customer lifetime value, and what seem to be the top like request? Like what would I like to have figured out before and after figuring out LTV? Like what would life look like before and after?
Before a lot of companies, when they go through this process and they figure it out, it's hard to look at their business in a different light.
Mm-hmm.
Once you know that customers are going to behave in a certain way over time, you can't ignore that. I think what a lot of companies come to us and we say, well, what is the major learning that they had? I think the greatest thing that they all have to sort out, what they say, I wish I knew more of when I started, was how to navigate their own organization. We find a lot of times that when companies start getting access to these messages, or marketing leaders start having access to this, and they're like, this is ridiculous. How come we can't look at lifetime value? They also wish that they spent more time educating people inside their own organization to be able to come along with them. That sometimes when we distill everything down for simplicity, like looking at lifetime value, we say, look, it's so obvious. Why can't people see it? That some organizational functions will have a difficult time with this. So one of the first presentations we did to a board around LTV, they looked at all this presentation, all this data, and they came back and they said, so Neil, what you're really saying is you want us to spend more money on customers today, and you're not accountable for it for several years. Like, oh, well, sorry, we'll keep our 1 or 2 week transaction windows. And it was just because we gave them, well, this is what we should do. We didn't help them along with the story. We didn't make them curious about why some customers were spending a lot and some were spending a little. And that's what I think a lot of organizations are figuring out. This is a classic lesson around organizational change. If you are going to move to a different KPI, a different metric, what is the level of change that an organization can tolerate? So we may think immediately, oh, we should bid on lifetime value. In fact, a lot of people are asking about acquisition. We'll talk, I know we have a slide later about the different ways people can do this. But I would encourage everyone here to say, you first have to think about what level of change your organization can accept. And so for some businesses, it's to say, we're going to bid on lifetime value right away. Others say, we're going to test with lifetime value. Or others say, you know what, we're going to surface lifetime value alongside all of our metrics, but we're not going to act on it just yet. Because we want people to speak the language. We want people to look and say, hey, this campaign brought in a lot of customers at a great CPA. And then we want somebody else. We don't want to force it on them. We want them to tell us, well, but these customers aren't going to stick around. And should that matter? And that's what you need to think about as leaders in this, is how you bring the organization along with this change and at what pace.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to open it up to questions. If anybody has questions, please share them either on the chat window or in the Q&A section. And while I wait for some other questions to come in, maybe I'll ask one more on this topic before we move on to how execution works and what are the top use cases, which is the next topic we'll move on to. One question that is constantly coming up in every conversation I have with a marketer right now, Neil, is what's going to happen with attribution? IDFAs going away, cookies going away, big changes in the privacy world, and measurement is going to take some sort of a hit. It's not clear what the difference will be. Like, what are you seeing, and what are your thoughts on measurement in general? And then the other question that keeps coming up, which is attribution / incrementality.
I don't see a plan where, just like with the changes in third-party cookies, I don't see a case where attribution models just disappear overnight. I think there's just going to become a gradual shift as to what tools marketers look at and deem reliable. So in some cases, some companies depend heavily on MMMs, but MMMs aren't really responsive enough, right? It's not enough to generate a result every 8 to 12 or 16 months. So instead they say, all right, we're going to fill in some of these gaps with incrementality tests and experimentation to give us more short-term data. And then when that happens, you see the use of the MMM becomes a little bit less. We use it for large channel allocations, but incrementality really helps us with the minutia. Or they may do, hey, MMMs are great, but we also need something like attribution models that are going to allow us to assign between keywords. And so I think all these tools have a particular role. I think that the importance of attribution models will fade a little bit simply because it's just individual transaction oriented. But I think what companies are starting to do is they're just kind of curious about what the models are saying, almost as an external advisor POV, to say, hey, we're not going to make huge changes in this. We're not going to report on the attribution model. But if it says that a campaign or a keyword are tremendously under or overvalued, then we're going to use it as a hypothesis for a test. And we're going to see why. And this is generally the approach that we're seeing when we see a number of different techniques come up for measuring performance, sometimes within conflict, is you say, instead of trying to determine a single source of truth, companies are saying, you know what, I'm okay having a group of almost trusted advisors, and I'll take a look and see what they say, and then we'll run a test and see who's right. And as some techniques have more credibility because they're proven and validated over time, and then others will fall away. But I just see this as part of the ebb and flow of marketing. But I don't think attribution models are going to undergo a huge resurgence in the next 3 to 4 years. It'll probably be more fading away.
Interesting. I wish I could go deeper into this topic, because like the concept of data clean rooms and like customer identity resolution across platforms is coming up, and that, but let's table that, because it's a whole separate discussion we can go into. A couple of questions have come in from the audience. Babe Berta is asking, if our spend is different per channel and our AOV is different per channel, does it make sense to calculate CLV per channel for those customers independently?
I would say yes. Remember, you're going to calculate lifetime value at an individual customer basis, and then you're rolling it up into groups so you can make judgments about the groups as a whole. So if you did see differences across channel, assuming that the numbers are still large enough for them to be statistically significant, you're going to see differences between channels. Now, with the spend, you're obviously going to see differences. You may have acquired 50,000 customers in one channel and only 1,000 in another. But that wouldn't affect, as long as they're large enough, what the average order value and the behaviors are. So I would say, yeah, as long as you're building from individual channels, it's worthwhile to build up, and then you can learn if you're investing in the right places.
Yeah, I will give an example of this. We worked with an e-commerce company that sold both men and women's products, jeans, and we built separate models for both those customers, because the products were completely different, the customers were completely different, and average order values were also completely different. And in another case where like it's just the channel that's different, and AOVs do tend to vary. So think about like same product being sold on Shopify and Amazon, but we're building a separate but we were building out a model. The model is pretty responsive. It picks up on the AOV being different. So you could still build the same model, but you're going for the same audience. It ended up working out where after you cut it by audience, you can see the difference in LTV by channel. But since the customer is basically the same customer base, we were able to hold that constant and still build one channel. So it becomes a little bit nuanced in practicality when we tried that. Two other questions have come in, and I'll start with Chris Westington's question. How have you managed profitability or earnings per share expectations with CLV strategy shifts that may present short-term headwinds to profitability, but long-term benefits to ROI? And this is another form of like, hey, can we just go acquire a ton of customers and that's going to show a lot more growth?
I wish it was that easy, right? Like here's the reality, and this goes back to the organizational comments that I made earlier, is that if you have shareholders or you have a board that is driving you towards short-term KPIs and saying, look, I don't care about the lifetime value or the value of all these customers we acquire. I want to see the number of new accounts that we have or the number of email addresses that were added to a list. Those are going to be in opposition. And there was a time in this where I would say, you need to convince everybody of your path forward. It's in the best nature of the business. And now I've almost softened that to say, there's that reality of what the organization can actually tolerate. And so what I might do on those types of approaches is say, look, if you were looking at serious impact to the bottom line numbers, and that was going to cause tension within the business. So it's not a startup, an established business, and all of a sudden you have to go back to the street and explain why customer acquisition costs have grown significantly, and you're going to see those returns later. I might almost take a step back to say, let's run smaller scale tests. Like, let's run something that's not going to be as disruptive. Let's keep 99% of your acquisition efforts in place. And let's start small where I can prove to you that these customers will spend. Or I can remove and say, these are low value customers you don't want to pay attention to. Or here's customers that are worth a retention campaign. Those aren't going to be as dramatic. They're not going to be observed from the street or in your quarterly numbers, but they're going to start building that momentum internally while minimizing the risk. And so really all we're doing here is we're figuring out what pace the organization can move. And if you think that there's going to be a lot of pushback internally or externally by changing those metrics, then we just scale back the test and we say, let's try something a little bit easier.
And a follow-up to that, in a subscription-based business, how do you view retention spend versus as a driver of CLV in that case?
You want to take that one? I can jump in.
I can, yeah. So first of all, I want to add on to your question. We've seen this happen so often. So imagine you're a startup about to go raise funding. More often than not, we are seeing that the investors are becoming very smart about how they view a company. They're not going to just do diligence on like, hey, just basic customer growth and sales growth. They're looking at growth accounting. They're looking at customer lifetime value growth and the value. And this is what Peter Fader's next big project is: valuation of companies based on the customer lifetime value. And if you look at some of the S1s and earning reports that are coming out, they're not yet required to report their cohort analysis type metrics, but it's very clear that things are moving in that direction. And I feel like I'm a strong believer that that's going to become a key indicator of the value of the company over time. And then the second question around, in a subscription business, how do you view retention spend as a driver of CLV? Neil, I remember watching a YouTube video from you, and I feel like there was a quote you said that just stuck with me. I say this again and again, and it's your best retention strategy is a good acquisition strategy. So I'm a big believer in product market fit and does the dog eat the dog food? One of our advisors has a paper on this. I highly recommend reading. So Eva Scarza out of HBS, who trained under Bruce Hardy, wrote a paper about retention and some of the futility of retention strategies the market tends to take. I highly recommend folks to look up that research and then decide how much should be spent on retention. Now, subscription business, at the end of the day, there's probably a case to be made for paid subscription as well. Today, most of the paid retention as well. Today, most of the retention strategies I'm seeing are using attentive or email to make sure that you are staying top of mind. But to be honest, when we think about subscription businesses, most subscription businesses are actually scared to email their customers because they might remind them that, hey, there's a subscription payment you're making each month that you oh yeah, thanks for reminding me, I'm going to go cancel that. So I've seen that challenge happen with consumer subscription businesses as well. But happy to chat more. Please reach out to me offline. I can share with you 3 different examples with 3 different answers, and it might be relevant depending on the type of business. This is a fun conversation. Let's move on to our next topic. How are these getting applied in the market today? So maybe Neil, you can start off with.
I'll give everybody the high level. This is a major poll question. This is the best I could do to add it to a slide. I'm sorry, I could have made it more visual. Here's what the basic one is. We talked about that first step, which is to say, how do you understand the differences between your customers? Now, as you think back to that spreadsheet that we started with, the first column being your ID, the second one being your lifetime value, you're going to have a lot of data inside your CRM systems, the products they purchased, the coupon codes, free shipping, all of those things are going to build out and give you a perspective. But you're also going to have behaviors you can measure, say, on your web analytics platform. Now, coming from the Google Analytics world, the Google world in general, there are 2 tools, Ads Data Hub, otherwise ADH, and Google Analytics. Those are sources of Google data, what's happening on your website, what we're observing on the larger network that you may want to take a look at, that you may want to say, well, how do things like in-market segments and affinity audiences, or how does website behavior change or impact what we see as being high or low lifetime value? So start with your CRM data, but just know that these other sources exist. And there's probably countless ones even beyond Google's ecosystem that you can combine to enrich and better understand who your best customers are. And then there's also tools. Google Surveys is one of them. It's kind of like these third-party survey-based tools that allow you to run really quick research questions to customers. This kind of allows you to be more proactive to say, I wish I could understand things like, well, who's in their consideration set? What other products might they be interested in? What share of wallet do I have? That's one of my favorite questions. So what companies do is they use these types of tools to re-engage customers and ask. And you can certainly use email to do that if you want, or these tools exist where generally for $50, $100, you get to ask a question to a population, either your high value customers, your low value customers, just to get more signals and information in than you already have. So everything in those first two techniques, just all about understanding, getting more data so that you have a better, richer picture. The bottom one, I think, is the one that's probably going to be even of more interest. How do we find more of these high value customers? Emad, you said it. I don't think I was as articulate in whatever video you saw because that sounded really good, but acquisition is much better than trying to develop or retain customers. If you get a great customer, they're going to spend. If you get a poor customer, you're going to end up spending a lot of money trying to get them to be just even slightly better. So what do you do? How do you acquire more of these customers? Well, the most common one that customers are doing is they're saying, I have a list of email addresses. These are my high value customers. Can I upload it into an ad platform? Google, we have Customer Match. And can you say, Google, use similar audiences to find me more people like those customers. Use all the signals that you have on the network side. Just go out and find more people like them. That's kind of the entry-level approach. It proves that it can work. It's easy. It's scalable. You don't have to do a lot of the analysis. You just say, these are high lifetime value customers. Go get me more. The second one is you can import lifetime value data into Google Analytics. So maybe you just have everything keyed. You don't have an email address to it. You have website traffic. And then Google Analytics can build similar audiences, also using the benefit of your website data. So what we go is we start really easy, just using email addresses, and we go a level deeper and we say, here's Google Analytics, but we're going to combine it with LTV data. And you're, okay, this is great. And then that last one is we see a lot of customers saying, well, now that I know what the lifetime value of a customer is, should I still use conversion value? Like, should I send a signal back up to my ad platform, back up to Google to say, this customer was worth $50, which may be their first order. But if I really know that their lifetime value is 100 times that amount, or I know this is all they're going to spend, shouldn't I feed that back to Google so that way I can get a better understanding as to what I'm driving with ad spend? And that's what I consider to be the more advanced automated route, but definitely where the market is moving. Now, there's nothing here that I'm saying on this to say, if a customer is worth $5,000, that you should bid up to $5,000 to acquire them. Absolutely not. All we see customers doing in these cases is they're saying, look, if I know these customers are worth a little more and these customers are worth a little less, let's just start by moving our bid slightly higher. Let's put a little bit more emphasis on tell the machine learning models to focus more on these types of customers and a little bit less on these types of customers. And what we're doing there is we're managing risk. So we're not just dumping all the money and saying, I want to spend $5,000 to acquire this customer. We're saying no. But if our bid targets were set at $50, maybe we just want to spend $52 or $53. We want to prove to ourselves that we're getting slightly better customers tomorrow than we were today. And then we can increase our bids a little bit more if we want to. But those are just three really easy ways. Once you have that metric, we can either just target based on the behaviors, we can target based on the lifetime value, or we can send that metric upstream.
Neil, what it seems like, and I've been following Google Analytics releases, and from what I've seen in terms of Google's roadmap, I'm very excited about where things are headed. Sounds like there's one more use case that we've now started seeing on the other big digital advertising platform is campaign budget optimization.
Yeah.
In near real time, as conversions are happening, you estimate the LTV and then start to move your budgets around based on that. There are a couple of other things you mentioned that are very interesting. The share of wallet one, I think, is also very interesting. So what we've been doing is we literally started to do this very recently, which is we're starting to compute like restaurants. So how much money does an average US customer spend on restaurants? And we basically looked at it. It turns out to be like about around $2,000 per person on average. And obviously there are some spenders that spend a lot more, but that tends to be the average. Now, given that you are running one of the restaurants in the US, you can compute your customer lifetime value and see what percentage of wallet you have. And that's a really cool analysis. And the fact that, there are enough panel data sets out there that you can do this analysis is really interesting, that you can kind of start to see how your lifetime value compares against other markets and industries. Now, one of my favorite topics, and there's a question out there we'll get to as well, but before we do that, I have a question that relates to Google, and that's about developing existing customers. And I want to come back to a topic that, as much as I mentioned that, hey, look, there is something to be said about retention and where you should or should not be. If you look at people running Facebook campaigns, what they'll do is they'll typically exclude current customers from any campaigns. They'll set up an exclusion audience, which will be mostly current customers. Is this something that Google advertisers on Google tend to do as well? Or is it that you're trying to go after every new acquisition or every new transaction as a new acquisition? Like, what's the typical strategy you've seen?
This is a good one. I would say that it ties to the organizational discipline of it. For instance, if we were to say, look, you're spending more money acquiring these customers, the assumption with lifetime value is that these customers will continue to buy. Mm-hmm. So how aggressively do you want to go after them for the second transaction or the third transaction? When should you get involved to try to develop those customers? And I think what you mentioned is like that best practice is to say, yes, you should be able to exclude them and only intervene when you know it's driving additional value. If you're forecasting that someone is going to come back every month for the next year and buy, it seems kind of silly then to approach them with as much excitement and interest each and every month when they're just going to come back and buy. And we all have those lists of companies where it's like, look, if they make something, I'm going to go buy it. And we feel embarrassed maybe for some companies. But that's, I know people that upgrade their phone every year. They don't need to be marketed to. I know airlines. I will fly American Airlines because they go from San Jose to my hometown of Chicago. They don't need to market to me. But that enters into an interesting area. So let's talk about the airline one just for an example, because I think it's important for people to think about the larger business implications. American Airlines could calculate and say, look, Neil will only fly us based on what we've observed. He flies us all the time. Reason, nobody else goes from San Jose to Chicago. Does American Airlines need to give me anything for my loyalty status? Do they need to? I mean, that sounds more like a bulk discount to say, well, you flew with us a whole bunch, so we're going to give you something better. But if they understood, they say, look, Neil's going to continue to fly because we're the best option out there. We don't need to give him anything more. Whereas they may want to focus on a customer to say there's more opportunity of winning this person over. And this is where we can't really extract the marketing lens from this larger customer-centric business, which is to say, if you're looking at lifetime value as your metric, you're assuming how people will behave over time. And I'm going to tie, by the way, in because I see a Q&A that touches on this as well. You're predicting how customers will behave over time. The next thing to think about is, well, if you know this and you believe this, are you able just to let go of those customers and let the models play out? Or do you feel like you constantly need to market and hold on to these customers? That's what balances companies. Ideally, to your point, they should exclude customers they've already acquired or target them differently. You're going to have to spend more. Customer acquisition can be 5 to 25 times more expensive than a retention action. So you need to separate them. But if you're still stuck in the transaction days, it's going to be hard to build that confidence to be like, hey, let go. These customers will be okay. It's not going to be incremental. Yeah.
But the custom audiences seems like a good option because you can be very targeted about the current customers, right? So you can run branding campaigns to stay top of mind. Sounds like and this is a blog post I need to write. I think there's some research to be done in this field where paid customer retention branding strategies might actually be cheaper than trying to run a ton of email and attentive type campaigns that are highly risky because you're pushing some information to somebody.
There's a lot of depth. The last thing I'll say on it, because I think it's important, is I can't stress to everyone here, don't overcomplicate it. This is a reason why we break down these lifetime value calculations as simple as possible, is to say, get an output that the research, the data supports works. and then try a simple customer and imagine similar audience campaign. There's a lot of nuance around it, right? You can start wrapping your head around all the things that will have to transform and change about your business. And what I'm saying with confidence here, and this is working with, I think 4,000 advertisers to date on this, is to say that change can and will happen, but it just doesn't need to happen today. The goal of any of this, the things that we're talking about back and forth, Emad, is we want businesses just to be slightly better tomorrow than they are today, which means that if you're looking at LTV, even if you're not bidding on it, if you have an LTV number that's regularly reported in your business, you're better off. If you're able to calculate LTV on acquisition versus waiting for multiple transactions, you're still better. If you're able to launch your first campaign and your CFO is okay with it, then you're better. Those steps are continuing. Don't feel like you need to take everything on all at once. You just need to be moving at a consistent pace, and the rest of the insights, the rest of the ideas, things like share of wallet and survey questions, those will all come with time.
Neil, why don't you repeat this question and let's answer this one. I think it's an important one as well.
Yeah. How are we defining LTV? So a lot of companies struggle with this. Buying from a company that was a startup in 2016 for multiple times, how would they classify me? Have trouble thinking past 1 year. Oh boy. So the academic answer to this is that we do look at the full lifetime of the customer. The package, one of the packages that we use is called BTYD, which is buy till you die. A large component of this package is calculating when we think somebody will die. Because in a retail business or travel business, you may call up a company and say, I hate you, I'm never going to fly with you again. And then they're like, yeah, but here's a cheap holiday rate. And you're like, oh, all right, this time I will. So we do look at it, the true lifetime of the customer. Now, to everything that we've been saying before, there are practical limits to what companies can accept. So while we encourage everyone to look at lifetime value, there are some companies where a CFO will say, I'll give you 6 months. I'll give you 1 year. And when we work on projects, we have to respect that timing, but we don't necessarily blind ourselves to what else is happening. So if I'm running an LTV model and someone says, look, cut it off after a year, I will do that. But I will also look at what the full model says. And I'll say, what would we do differently if we looked at the full potential of customers versus what they did in the next year? And that's what I'll debate, because I won't debate the CFO and the finance team just on hypotheticals. But if I would actually make different investment decisions, if I would behave differently, build different products because of what happened if I looked past a year, then I want to have that discussion. If it's exactly the same, then as disappointing as it is for being short term, that's kind of where I'd have to leave it. Emad?
Neil, one thing, my thoughts on this are, you asked a simple question. You can start with a simple question. If I don't compete, I think that I completely agree that you could use full-time, full life cycle or a truncated version. But the question you should ask is that by not computing customer lifetime value, will I be confusing my recent customers as low value customers, right? And that's a question about, like, if I just added up my last year revenue, and I'll share a story from PayPal. So when I worked at PayPal, I was very excited to see that we would compute customer lifetime value for every single merchant. I saw that column show up in our Teradata database. I'm like, wow, we're really advanced. We have 1 year lifetime value, 2 year lifetime value. Then I go to one of our analysts and ask, like, hey, what's this lifetime value? He's like, oh, this is just the total summation of their last 365 days of revenue. I'm like, wait a minute. This means that, like, we are customers, if we're seeing a lot of growth in any business and we're seeing all those customers have just 1 or 2 transactions, we're not accounting for the fact that many of them are going to keep coming back. So I think that's one question to kind of think about, that are you reconciling for that difference? And after that, it doesn't matter. Make sense. Make sure that you can do it for a reasonable amount of time that you can get the business to agree on. But full lifetime value would obviously be better. So I completely agree with you on that. We have about 7 more minutes and had a whole topic to cover. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just quickly open up our last poll. And while we have that poll going on, which is around how have you so far leveraged this, we would love to quickly share one more thought on a topic and maybe then quickly go into Q&A. And my recommendation, so we help companies do this. How do you get started? My first recommendation is build a business case. And if you guys don't have one, shoot me a note. I have a Google sheet ready that like you put in your 3 numbers on what your AOV is, what your general retention rate looks like, and you can come up with a great business case on why you should have this conversation in your company. Second is to get your organization to buy in. You will typically have to have a few conversations. You're going to have to, for sure, have a conversation with your FP&A team or a team that allocates your budgets. You're going to have a conversation with your data team that has the data and is going to respond to you and saying, hey, yes, can I get you the data to build the model and get things going? You're going to probably have a conversation with your marketing team and your product management team. So those are kind of the first 2 steps. And then lastly, start small and show progress. Those are kind of the recommendations I see and Neil and I chatted about. Neil, if you want to chime in on this, tell me what else are your thoughts that you've seen.
I love that. I have nothing to add to those. I think that they're perfect. My final thought for this group is to say these types of things, it's an ongoing process. You learn a little bit, you learn a little bit more. But for everybody that I've worked with in this field, Emad, this is how you and I started talking a couple of years ago. This is why we talk to these professors that built all these models, is that there's a collective community of people that have just grown to say, this is what we've learned. This is that spreadsheet that you have in terms of making the business plan is wonderful. Knowing how to navigate through organizations is great. So be part of that ongoing conversation. If there's anything that either of us can do to help, to answer questions, things that you didn't ask about, or maybe things that just come over the holiday break, if it just pops up and be like, I wonder if we could do this. What's fantastic about this webinar is that I hope that it's giving you the opportunity just to get a sense as to what the foundation, what the process looks like, how it can be applied. And then there's still more learning to come. So almost kind of guide us in that direction to say, well, what are the next set of questions we can ask just to keep that momentum going? To say, well, this is what will happen after January 2021. After you convince other people in the organization, let us know what those next round of questions are. I know you can find us. I'm not sure if your email address is on the deck later on, but you can certainly email us, LinkedIn, whatever works. Oh, yeah. There you go. That's a nice summation of it. Yeah, let us know how we can help you with these plans.
Let's open it up for more Q&A. We have 4 more minutes, so maybe we can answer a couple more questions. And maybe I'll ask this one last question that came in prior while others jump in with any of their remaining Q&As. Would you recommend leveraging CLV for measurement first and then targeting and then striking a balance between how do you think about the striking a balance between targeting and measurement?
That depends. It depends on the org. Look, I think that all businesses, even those that are not going to be able to implement lifetime value, should still have it as a metric. I mean, if people are going to look at bounce rate and time on site as part of their dashboard, but they can't look at lifetime value, I'm like, come on. You don't need to bid. People don't. I hope people aren't bidding on things like bounce rate. But I want you to be aware of it because I think that that's what provokes the conversation. But I think the same thing, what separates the academic discussion is to say, can we put this into practice? Can we use it? And that's why I say those small scale tests make it real. That's what gets exciting. It's like you can look at a picture of something for only so long until you say, well, I want to try building it or I want to try flying it. That's what you want to get to. So you can separate them in the short term. You can just be curious. And I know some analyst teams that say, look, marketing isn't ready for this yet, but we want to watch the business through this lens. And I think that's awesome. But your goal, your ambition should always be to get to targeting.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. I think this is a very relevant question that just came in, Neil. What are your thoughts about this? And maybe we just repeat the question.
Yeah, repeat it for me. I didn't see it.
Yeah, so it's how can we adjust models for abnormalities such as changes in shopping habits due to COVID?
Oh boy. Oh boy. All right. In 3 minutes, no, 2 minutes, I'll give you my best, what I know. First of all, we are not going to exclude any data. That's the first thing. The data is what it is. The second thing is when we look at this type of segmentation, what we've actually been doing is segmenting customers by acquisition date. We generally do this anyways, where we look at month, January, February, September. Here we're actually going and looking pre versus, during COVID customers, we're finding out that they have individual behaviors, and we're likely going to see different behaviors as a vaccine rolls out. So we're going to see a third cohort of customers, all with their best preferences. Best advice I have for companies right now is don't take the insights that you can gather from current customers for granted and say, oh, they behave just like all the customers we've had in the past. Likely the answer is no, which means there's a data collection activity out there to say, how much can you learn about what your current COVID customers are doing? I can't tell you personally how many new businesses I've been to simply because Amazon's been out of stock. It's like, oh, I'm trying new businesses and they're not engaging with me. They're just saying, oh, well, Neil only has purchased once. Historically, that means he's low lifetime value. No, learn, explore more about these segments. So keep all the data, segment really customers by acquisition date. You'll start to see differences. And then the third thing is gather as much information as you can about their behaviors, their preferences, what they love, because that may persist a lot more than expecting the return of pre-2020 customers in the future.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing we've done, Neil, is we typically use a rolling window of customer cohorts for the model. And we know that over time, this adjusts for a lot of changes. So for example, like I mentioned an extreme case for people to get this idea. Let's say that we had data from Coca-Cola for buying behavior. That's a company that's 100 years old. We don't use all 100 years of data to go compute their customer lifetime value for cohorts they're acquiring now. We use some relevant time window. So when it comes to practicality of implementing these models, there are a lot of nuances that show up that you get to resolve, and this is just one of those. Can you account for absolute changes in behavior? Yeah, and this goes to like there are other questions to answer, like should you be using future value or for in all use cases, or should you be using future versus total? We talked a little bit about that, but all of those questions, happy to answer. I know we're out of time. We've had some really great results on through a great discussion throughout the poll, throughout the webinar, and really good poll results. Looks like most companies aren't there yet. They're still looking. Some of you guys have started, but most people are open to moving to this part of using LTV as a measurement metric, which is really exciting to see. All right, at the end, we're going to send up some follow-up emails as with the slides, as well as maybe contact information. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. And thank you everybody for attending today. And Neil, thank you so much for joining and answering some of these really fun questions.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Hope to stay in touch with everybody in the future.
See you guys. Bye.
Take care.